Throughout history, humanity has endured countless disasters, wars, famines, natural catastrophes, but no single disease left such a devastating and lasting mark as the Black Death, the plague that ravaged Europe in the 14th century and forever changed the course of human history. In just a few short years, this deadly pandemic claimed millions of lives and reshaped society in ways that are still felt today. Its shadow continues to remind us how fragile human civilization truly is. The Black Death was first recorded in Asia in the early 14th century. Historians believe it originated in the steppes of Mongolia and northern China, spreading westward along the Silk Road. It traveled with caravans and merchant ships, and wherever it went, destruction followed. In 1347, the plague reached Europe through the Crimean port of Kaffa. From there, ships carried the invisible killer into the Mediterranean, landing in Italy and unleashing chaos across the continent. The disease spread with terrifying speed. In an age without modern medicine or scientific understanding, people had no way of grasping what was happening to them. Today we know the cause was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas living on rats. But in the 14th century, Europeans could not see such microscopic enemies. For them, the plague was a punishment from God, a curse, or some dark supernatural force. The symptoms were horrific. It began with high fever, chills, and exhaustion. Victims would vomit blood and grow weak within hours. Soon, painful swellings known as buboes appeared, filled with pus and blood. Dark spots and internal bleeding turned skin black in patches, which is why the epidemic became known as the Black Death. Mortality was staggering. In some towns, more than 70% of the population died within days. Families were wiped out in a single week, and bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Panic consumed Europe. Without knowledge of bacteria or medicine, people turned to religion, superstition, and fear. Many believed the plague was God's punishment for the sins of mankind. Others thought the air itself had been poisoned, a deadly miasma that infected anyone who breathed it. In response, radical religious movements arose, such as the Flagellants, groups of men and women who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, begging God to spare them from death. But fear also bred violence. Jews and other minorities were accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the disease. Across Europe, pogroms erupted, entire communities were burned, tortured, or massacred, while the plague continued to kill indiscriminately. Hatred and ignorance proved almost as destructive as the epidemic itself. The demographic consequences were catastrophic. Between 1347 and 1351, historians estimate that between 25 and 30 million people perished, roughly one-third of Europe's entire population. Entire villages vanished, towns were abandoned, churches and monasteries overflowed with the dead. Even the clergy, who were expected to give last rites, died in huge numbers, leaving society without guidance or hope. Yet from this unimaginable tragedy emerged profound social and economic change. The massive loss of life created a severe shortage of labor. Serfs and peasants who had long lived under the oppression of feudal lords suddenly found themselves in high demand. Landowners were forced to offer better wages and living conditions to keep workers. For the first time in centuries, peasants gained bargaining power. Feudalism, the backbone of medieval Europe, began to crack. Cities, too, underwent transformation. Trade collapsed and many industries disappeared. But those who survived found new opportunities. Merchants and artisans grew in wealth and influence, laying the foundations for a new middle class. In time, these changes would help spark the Renaissance, an age of rebirth in art, science, and culture. Paradoxically, the Black Death, while destroying the old world, helped give rise to the modern one. Art and literature reflected the trauma. Death became an obsession. Images of skeletons, graveyards, and hell-filled paintings, songs, and poems. One of the most famous motifs was the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, a reminder that kings and peasants alike must dance with death. No one, regardless of wealth or power, could escape the plague. Writers such as Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, vividly described the horrors of the epidemic and the desperate attempts of people to flee cities and survive. The cultural impact was enormous, but so too were the longer-term effects. The labor shortage spurred innovation in agriculture and technology. The weakening of feudalism shifted the balance of power and planted seeds of social mobility. The failure of the church to explain or stop the plague shook people's faith in its authority, opening the way for reform movements and new ways of thinking about religion and the world. Looking back, the Black Death was more than a medical disaster. It was a turning point in history. It reshaped economies, altered politics, transformed art, and changed how people understood life, death, and faith. Its scars remained visible for centuries, influencing Europe well into the modern era. Today, nearly 700 years later, the Black Death continues to serve as a warning. In a world that still faces pandemics, it reminds us how fragile our societies are, but also how resilient and adaptable humanity can be. The plague was not only a tragedy of unimaginable scale, it was an event that forced humanity to evolve, to rethink its structures, and to step into a new age. It stands as one of the darkest yet most transformative chapters in the story of mankind. Today, nearly 700 years later, the Black Death continues to serve as a warning. In a world that still faces pandemics, it reminds us how fragile our societies are, but also how resilient and adaptable humanity can be. The plague was not only a tragedy of unimaginable scale, it was an event that forced humanity to evolve, to rethink its structures, and to step into a new age. It stands as one of the darkest yet most transformative chapters in the story of mankind.